It's recently come to my attention that Spain has the world's best economy. Yes, Spain. Despite the housing crisis and the depressingly low average salary, despite the national debt and the recent surge in prices, we're actually doing better here than everywhere else. Honestly, when I read the headline in The Economist, I thought they must be joking. But other publications picked up on the story, and it's not going away. So let's look at their argument. Maybe Spain's economy is doing great, and I just didn't know it. The people at The Economist say they rank countries on 5 factors: real GDP growth, stock market returns, unemployment, core inflation, and fiscal balances. Is the country running a budget surplus or a deficit, in other words? I won't bore you with too much data, but let's talk about it. Hey everybody, it's Daniel. Welcome back to Spain to Go, the best podcast in the entire multiverse for all things Spain. This is episode 99. Wow. Happy to be here. I am very grateful that you are listening. If you would like to donate to this podcast, head over to expatmadrid.com/donate and send some money over in my direction. I appreciate it. Any amount starting at €3 is absolutely fine, and I will spend it on coffee, protein, and sparkling water here in Barcelona or elsewhere in Spain. Thanks for that. Let's talk about the Spanish economy, starting with the 2024 GDP growth. Spain's gross domestic product grew about 3% in 2024, which is better than the other big European economies. The UK is growing slowly these days, and Germany barely at all. But is GDP growth contributing to people's well-being? It's an open question. One of Spain's main industries is tourism, which just keeps growing. According to The Week, in 2024, Spain received 94 million tourists, which leaves it second only to France in the global tourism ranking. Tourism has produced some backlash. Those 2 ladies with squirt guns here in Barcelona last year definitely got some attention in the international press. But as far as I can tell, most people aren't up in arms about there being too many visitors. Now that I live 15 minutes walk from any major attraction, I don't see many tourists at all, and it's fine. And Barcelona, that famous tourist hotspot, has dozens of neighborhoods where tourism isn't an issue at all. Just don't walk through Plaza Catalunya on a weekend. Also, most of the articles about Spain's economy cite population growth through immigration as one of the drivers of the increase in GDP. More people means more economic activity. Not everybody is thrilled about immigration, and also, if GDP grows along with population, the GDP per capita might not grow at all. So I'm skeptical about this one. But let's move on. Inflation is down in Spain. Core inflation in December 2024 was 2.7%, which is way down from almost 8% at the peak in 2023. That's good news. But what is core inflation? Apparently, it's just the rate of inflation with all the food and energy costs taken out, because those things tend to have more volatile prices. I think it's what the Spanish papers call inflación subyacente, the word subyacente meaning underlying. In any case, people spend a lot of money on food, gas, and electricity, so just removing those things from your calculations is going to give a very partial picture. Core inflation moves up and down at different times than the regular consumer price index, la IPC in Spanish, and is considered by some a better indicator of economic trends than the price of onions, for example. Overall inflation, which I've just discovered is called headline inflation, has recently been higher than core inflation, and back in 2022, it was over 10% for a few months. I wrote about inflation briefly in my article Olive Oil Crisis when I found myself paying $9.25 a liter for store brand extra virgin. That was way back in episode 55 of this podcast, if you'd like to take a look. The spike in the price of olive oil was blamed on a drought down in Andalusia. The price has since gone down to €6 and change, at least for olive oil. It would seem that the other food prices have been going down a bit as well. Still, everything is a lot more expensive than it was a decade ago. Let's talk unemployment. Unemployment is a long-standing issue in Spain. These days, the unemployment rate is hovering around 10%, which out here is considered to be very good news. Of course, in the US, 10% unemployment would be a huge crisis. Here, it's way better than what we usually have to deal with. So, 10% unemployment good. However, youth unemployment is around 25%, which is bad. As I've written and talked about many times before, Spain's labor laws make it hard to fire older workers, which means it's often impossible to hire younger ones. Protecting people who already have jobs is fine, of course, but it comes at the expense of young people who spend prime working years searching for jobs, doing overpriced masters, or going abroad to work. Another thing that's worth mentioning about unemployment statistics is that governments love manipulating the numbers if they can. So now, for example, there are a couple of million people in Spain on contracts called fijo discontinuo, sort of a seasonal permanent contract in which people are receiving unemployment checks for part of the year, but aren't officially counted as unemployed. This is pretty common in my old field, English teaching. Those summer months when my income used to go to zero are a thing of the past, apparently. It's probably the opposite in tourism. Less work in winter and lots of summer jobs. So can we trust the official unemployment numbers? I don't know. None of this is bad for workers, but it doesn't give me confidence in the official numbers. Then there's the issue of the underground economy, a topic I thought quite a bit about back when I was a part of it. I once wrote about Spain's attempt to juice its GDP by bringing drugs and prostitution into the official economic data, for example. That was a long time ago, probably around 2012. These days, I'm a member of the bourgeoisie, and I have accountants to deal with my tax situations, both here and in the US. I'll put in the show notes a link to Taxes for Expats. They're the ones who do my U.S. taxes. You have to file U.S. taxes if you're living abroad. Long story, go to Taxes for Expats using my link in the show notes, and you will get a discount of $25 on your tax preparation services. Anyway, all this to say that I am no longer a part of the underground economy. But the underground economy is still there, allegedly equivalent to about 17% of Spain's GDP. At least some of the officially unemployed people are probably working on the underground economy, in cash under the table, and a lot of people on contracts may be getting part of their salaries off the books in cash as well. That was pretty common back when I was not a member of the bourgeoisie. I assume it still is. All this is another reason to take the official data with a grain of salt. The stock market is another positive thing about Spain's economy. The Spanish stock exchange is called the IBEX 35, and it closed 2024 with a 15% gain over the previous year. Interesting fact, the Spanish stock market's high was way back in 2007. Since then, it's struggled along, failing to gain value. The 15% increase last year brought it up into the same general area it was in 2007. But looking at the last 15 or so years for some context, it's anybody's guess where it'll go from here. In contrast, the S&P 500 over in the US has gone up about 400% over the same period. On the other hand, I'm not sure what stock market growth really has to do with the daily lives of regular people. In Spain, it's not like in the US. Most people here don't invest in the stock market. They just pay into their obligatory government pensions and hope for the best. I've looked into opening a pension plan through my bank's website, and I'm always put off by the high fees. I remember back in the day, a Spanish friend was telling me about this from her perspective. She and her husband didn't have much savings and didn't believe in the stock market. When they had money, they would buy a new flat somewhere. At the time, I thought they were being unreasonable. But looking at what's actually happened to the stock market versus real estate over the past couple of decades, their strategy seems pretty smart. Now, I suspect most people don't really know what the stock market is. At best, the stock market is down sounds like a smart thing to say, maybe as a synonym for the economy is bad. In reality, the stock market goes up or down in ways that have little to do with the overall economy. And of course, the economy can grow or shrink by a few percent without it necessarily affecting your personal situation. As usual, I like to be wary of statistics. But another thing that people like to talk about is the national debt, and I'm not at all convinced that they've done their research before speaking. In any case, Spain has more debt than a lot of countries, but it's not all bad news. The debt to nominal GDP ratio is about 104%, and that number has been going down since a spike in 2020, when apparently they borrowed a lot of money. The budget deficit has also been decreasing. I don't really feel like spending the rest of my day figuring out exactly what debt to nominal GDP means, so let's just say the Spanish debt is high, but not totally out of line with other developed countries. I'm old enough to remember the Great Recession when suddenly the debt from the pigs, Portugal, Italy, Greece, and Spain, was threatening to tear Europe apart. This thing where Spain is an economic powerhouse is a little bit funny, actually, when you think back to all that. The Guardian mentions that the Spanish government is hiring more civil servants, running a deficit, and spending the EU COVID relief funds to grow the GDP. Here closer to home, El Heraldo de Aragon says that there are 500,000 new government employees since Pedro Sanchez became president. So the big question is, will any of this growth be sustainable? I'd like to wrap up with a serious question. What is a good economy anyway? I'm about 2/3 of the way through a book called Spain by Michael Reed. Reed is apparently the former Spain correspondent for The Economist. And since we started with The Economist here, let's end there too. I've got a few beefs with the book. One of them is his focus on government and big business to the exclusion of everyone else. On page 183, for example, he complains about the vast mass of low-productivity small and micro businesses, which he defines as anything with under 50 employees. I think that's bullshit, but a lot of economic commentators seem to agree with this theory. As someone who owns a micro business myself and spends most of my time and money at low-productivity small businesses, I think the economic journalists are way out of touch. Those small businesses include basically every street-level business in Spain. They're the people who are doing useful things in their local community, the shops and services that make Spanish neighborhoods worth living in. And what's more, I believe that the government taxing all of us to the brink of extinction so they can hand money over to the EU so that the EU can give some of it back to them as COVID relief so that the government can offer small businesses a bit of money to buy a laptop after 6 months of red tape and 2 years wait for the payment, is not really economic growth. It's just more useless bureaucracy that produces nothing. But the laptop example, that's the kind of thing these people in government actually do. It's called the Kit Digital, and it's been a multi-billion euro failure. Still, the people in government get to put these sorts of failures into their report on the digital economy that they send up to Brussels, and then they get to pat themselves on the back for being so generous with us lowly business owners. Businesses produce wealth in a society, and government at best can set the conditions for that wealth creation. But big government plans to improve the economy work poorly more often than not, and I remain unconvinced. About half this macro data cited by The Economist seems to be largely irrelevant to the experience of real people, the people hanging out in my neighborhood and struggling to get by. Maybe your neighborhood is different, but after all this, does Spain have the world's best economy in 2025? Sure, as long as you ignore the massive housing crisis and the fact that a ton of people earn 1,300 euros a month and the 25% youth unemployment and the horrific tax burdens, and the fact that a lot of the economy is based on seasonal jobs in bars and hotels. If you ignore all those things, we're doing great. The high unemployment and financial instability vibe we had during the Great Recession was real, and that's gone. At least here in Catalonia, people seem to be doing okay. But as we've repeatedly seen over the last few decades, things can and do change overnight, and not always for the better. For now, let's bask in this relative prosperity. Tomorrow may bring something much different. That's about all I got for today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I am suspicious of macro data in economics for several reasons. Another reason that didn't work its way into this episode really is the fact that I've traveled around quite a bit at this point and seen wildly different economies in action. On paper, you could look at the GDP per capita of my wife's hometown down in Kerala at the southern tip of India and decide that it's a total dump. But when I go there, I have a completely different impression. I love it. And of course, GDP per capita in my home state, Arizona, back in the US, is double what it is here in Catalonia. But that doesn't mean I would want to live in Arizona. GDP per capita, I think, has rather little to do with the quality of someone's life. The fact that thousands of Americans are now thinking of moving to Spain for a better lifestyle is a demonstration of this. There's a much lower material standard of living out here, but we're doing just fine. 2 episodes ago, back in episode 97, we talked about the possible decline of Europe, and I think it's possible that Europe is in decline and that Spain is still doing pretty well compared to other European countries. The fact that Spain is doing better than Germany might be a symptom of Europe's decline. However, we were talking in the comments over on that one. I was talking with Peter over there in the comments on the Decline of Europe article, and I mentioned over there that I'm not certain that constant economic growth is a concept with a lot of future to it. It might keep going, or it might not. We might have to reorganize ourselves around some other objective. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's the typical idea that environmentalists have been talking about forever, that a forest is not part of your GDP, but chopping the forest down would become part of your GDP. That is not necessarily the best we can do as a species. Not to get all transcendental here or anything, but a lot of the things that make life worth living are not part of the GDP and never will be. So, like I said, I think the people who write for The Economist are a bit out of touch with the real concerns of people, and there are a lot of things that the data doesn't really reflect. What do you think? You can leave me a comment over on the blog expatmadrid.com. You can find me on Instagram. I'm Daniel Welsh over there, Welsch for my last name, Daniel Welsh on Instagram. I am also on YouTube. Look for Learn Spanish with Daniel. I really should get around to making some more Spanish videos over there. You've got every episode of the podcast up there on YouTube, as well as some travel videos. I recently went on a bike tour across the Extremadura region in Spain. I've got several videos about that. It was an awesome experience. Head over to biketourinspain.com if you're interested in bike tours. It's a very niche thing, but I had a great time. And Raul over there has a very good route set up with hotels and everything along the way, so you can have an adventure without having to worry too much about organizing your own logistics. If you sign up for that, tell Raul that you heard about him on my podcast, Daniel over at Spain to Go, and you can check out the videos about the bike tour over on my YouTube channel, Learn Spanish with Daniel. You can look for me on Amazon. I've written a lot of books for Spanish speakers to learn English. If you are listening to this podcast, you do not need to learn English from me, but if you have Spanish-speaking friends who might be interested, you could give them some of my books. I don't know, buy copies for everyone you know. That would help me out a lot. Just look for my name over on Amazon, the Amazon store closest to you. You could also, as I mentioned before, send me a donation, expatmadrid.com/donate. I appreciate it. You can attach your questions for future episodes there. I can get a message along with your donation, and I appreciate it a lot. expatmadrid.com/donate. That's about all for today. Thanks once again for listening. Hasta la próxima. Bye.